In terms of U.S. response to date, Washington has made it clear that it supports freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in Syria, and that it clearly condemns assaults on peaceful demonstrations, renewed arrest sweeps, failures to fulfill promises to release thousands still held in deplorable conditions in jail for political reasons, as well as the unleashing of thugs against civilian protesters and foreign embassies. The latest episode taking place yesterday when pro-Assad supporters attacked the American and French embassies in Damascus. As the Assad regime's panicked and ruthless iron fist and velvet glove approach to the uprising continues to fail, all eyes are now focused on the August 1st start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, when the minority Alawite regime's slaughter of predominantly Sunni Muslims could transform the uprising into the sectarian bloodbath that many are predicting. To help end the bloodshed, Washington will need to be equally ruthless in its approach. If the United States and its European allies really seek to force the Assad regime to lead a democratic transition and facilitate the Assad regime's eventual exit from the political scene, they will need to target Syrian energy, as Mona mentioned, to deprive the regime of vital foreign exchange earnings and curtail economic bailouts from Arab Gulf monarchies that have historically prevented the regime from instituting genuine change. There is an opportunity to target Syrian energy. Syrian oil production has been in steady decline since the 1980s and now is around 390,000 barrels a day. Syria exports around 148,000 barrels a day, with revenues directly accruing to the state. According to the IMF and the U.S. government, oil revenues make up about a third, between a quarter and a third of revenue, with the remainder of taxes coming from corporate and public sector employee taxes. As the protests have hit the Syrian economy and currency hard and are expected to substantially decrease tax receipts, Damascus is likely to become increasingly reliant on oil revenue. The primary instruments at Washington's disposal concern depriving the Assad regime of critical foreign exchange earnings. These measures could include pressuring purchasers of Syrian oil. The Obama administration could prod the chief buyers of Syrian oil, companies in Germany, Italy, France, and Holland, to stop purchasing the regime's heavy, sweaty crude. Second, pressuring for foreign energy companies to divest. The Obama administration, together with the European Union, could pressure Western multinational energy companies involved in Syria, including Royal Dutch Shell, Total, Croatia's Ina Nafta, and Petro-Canada, to divest their Syrian operations. Third, interrupting tanker payment and clearance mechanisms. Syrian oil sales are largely handled through the state-owned Commercial Bank of Syria, Syria's largest bank by far in terms of assets. Washington sanctioned the commercial bank in 2004 and forced U.S. banks to close their correspondent accounts. Many European banks closed their correspondent accounts as well, but a number have left them open. If the Obama administration could press the European Union to sanction the CBS or just persuade individual European banks to stop doing business with the CBS, it could effectively close off the way the regime processes its money. Next, sanctioning tanker traffic. In the past, the United States has targeted shipping vessels as part of strengthening of sanctions on its adversaries, including the Helms-Burton Act on Cuba. Washington, together with the European Union, could issue a decision by which any ship hauling Syrian oil would be banned from any future business in the United States or the European Union. Next, targeting imported refined gasoline and diesel products. Syria became a net importer of oil 4 years ago, years ahead of industry estimates. Diesel is Syria's Achilles heel in terms of energy. Everything from irrigation pumps to home furnaces and trucks burn diesel, which is heavily subsidized by the state. But Syria's upper and middle classes rely much more heavily on gasoline, primarily to fuel automobiles. While targeting either fuel is a blunt instrument, it could be used at a critical time, especially as part of any attempt to pressure Damascus and Aleppo's trading families to cut ties with the regime. But using such measures too soon in the wrong way could end up hitting the Syrian population as a whole, thereby playing into the regime's repeated pattern of blaming the uprising on a U.S. conspiracy, which it did last week in response to Ambassador Robert Ford's overnight visit to Hama. Last, Washington could pressure Arab monarchies to hold back oil bailouts. Syria often turns to its regional states for crude oil and oil revenue charity when it's in a bind, most notably Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. In the face of the regime's increasingly brutal crackdown, the United States should persuade Baghdad, Riyadh, and Doha to withhold oil or petrodollar support from the Syrian regime. In conclusion, targeting Syrian energy as part of a coordinated unilateral and multilateral political and diplomatic strategy would help create necessity in the Syrian regime to institute the kind of political reforms necessary to lead the country towards a democratic transition. Thus far, European allies have voiced some concerns of sanctions fatigue as a result of Washington's earlier effort to impose measures on Iran to change its behavior, a process that so far has had mixed results. To overcome European reticence, the United States should start with as pinpointed a measure as possible, widening its approach in tandem with the scope of the Assad regime's crackdown on its own population. And very finally, I'd like to commend the recent actions by Ambassador Robert Ford inside of Syria. From someone who lived in Syria for a very long time, nothing beats being there on the ground. It helps you read the texture of what's going on, and it's not just about engaging the regime. Ambassador Ford is also meeting with opposition figures on the ground in Syria and should be commended for that. But most importantly, his visit to Hama, as well as his statements on Facebook following the attack on the U.S. Embassy, show that Ford's placement in Damascus helps put America's adversaries in the Assad regime into dilemmas which define them and corner them in policy terms. Thanks very much.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. I'm pleased to be here, and I've submitted a written testimony, which I request be put in the record so that I may be brief. Thank you. Let me make 3 observations about the state of affairs in Syria. First, over the last 4 months, human rights violations in Syria have increased considerably. At least 1,500 Syrians have been killed and countless more wounded, tortured, arrested, intimidated, or harmed in some other way. Second, protests throughout Syria will likely continue for the near future, and unfortunately, so will the Syrian regime's brutal response to the Syrian people's calls for freedom. Third, most importantly, the Syrian regime itself, particularly President Bashar al-Assad, is directly and wholly responsible for this tragic state of affairs. Its response is further evidence that Assad is not and will not be a partner in a better Middle East. Before the protests and subsequent violence erupted in Syria a few months ago, the international community primarily focused on Syrian actions outside of its borders. For decades, the Syrian government has been a state sponsor of terrorism, maintaining an increasingly intimate relationship with terrorist groups and rogue states, particularly Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, and North Korea. For nearly 4 decades, the Syrian leadership has undermined freedom and democracy in Lebanon. Since 2003, it has helped to destabilize Iraq, often serving as the primary transit point for jihadis determined to harm countless Americans and Iraqis. And just a few years ago, the Assad regime covertly built a gas-cooled, graphite-moderated nuclear reactor with North Korean assistance, an effort in direct contravention of Syria's non-proliferation obligations. Now, the focus has shifted inside Syria's borders. Events over the last few months have demonstrated that Syria's domestic policy cannot be ignored. Smaller protests in early 2011, spurred by events in Tunisia and Egypt, gave way to more fervent demands for freedom by the Syrian people. After some Syrian youths were detained and tortured by their government simply for painting graffiti that criticized the Syrian regime, the Syrian people's frustrations reached new heights. Since then, a steady stream of increasingly massive and largely peaceful protests has erupted throughout much of the country. Unfortunately, the Syrian regime has responded with violence, repression, and insufficient reforms. Killings and arbitrary detentions have escalated. Reports emanating from around the country tell tales of mass arrests, gruesome torture, attacks on religious sites, killings during peaceful funeral marches, and the murder of young Syrians. The injured have been denied medical attention. Indeed, on occasion, Syrian security forces have taken over hospitals in an effort to better target and eliminate protesters. Key portions of the Syrian security services, particularly the 4th Armored Division and the Republican Guard, led by Maher al-Assad, the president's brother, have been responsible for many of the atrocities to date. With heavy materiel like tanks and helicopter gunships, Syrian protesters are being killed and wounded for demanding their rights, the freedom of speech, the ability to determine their leadership, and the power to seek better lives for themselves and their children. Others have faced the wrath of the Shabiha, ruthless gangs intimately connected to the Syrian regime, who have also viciously harmed protesters. Let me be clear, the situation in Syria is grim. It is tragic, and there should be no doubt. Syrian President Assad, working through these forces, is responsible for the countless human rights violations that we are witnessing in Syria today. Time and time again, across the generations, the Syrian regime has demonstrated its willingness and its capability to use systemic, indiscriminate brute force against its own people. The mission of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Committee is to promote, defend, and advocate internationally recognized human rights norms. Today, the Assad regime's actions run utterly counter to that effort. At this time, it appears that the bloodshed will continue. The Syrian regime has repeatedly sought, so far unsuccessfully, to divide the protesters and incite mass sectarian violence. Importantly, it has also refrained from making any real reforms that could stem protesters' demands. Given the regime's unrepresentative nature and the brutality of the crackdown, it is difficult to conceive of any reforms by Assad that will be anything more than a facade. What options does this leave for the international community? In a strictly humanitarian sense, Syrian refugees, those in isolated towns, would benefit from the free flow of much-needed assistance. Given limitations on medical services, protesters in particular would benefit from blood-clotting bandages, which have saved lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. But such as it is, simply providing humanitarian assistance is not a panacea. Given the nature of events in Syria, the only way to truly halt the bloodshed, beyond total acquiescence to the Assad regime, is a holistic response involving key members of the international community working together to push Assad from power while pulling in a new leadership. Such a strategy starts with two critical realizations. First, the United States and the international community cannot afford to be indecisive or unclear. Hedging is particularly harmful, as it emboldens the regime and discomfits the protesters. It must be made clear to the Syrian regime that the world will not allow the status quo to continue. Second, even if Syrian President Assad survives the current turmoil, a very real possibility, he is clearly no longer someone the international community can or should deal with. The violence in Syria has been horrific. It has also been clarifying. Events in Syria over the last few months have demonstrated, once and for all, the nature of the Syrian regime led by President Bashar al-Assad. Nearly 2 months ago, President Obama said that Syrian President Assad can lead the transition or get out of that way. Can lead that transition or get out of the way. Assad has clearly made his choice. Change in Syria will not be easy, bloodless, or satisfying. It could involve elements of the regime remaining in power. But at a minimum, it is clear that the leadership of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has failed the Syrian people. To conclude, 1 year before Tom Lantos founded the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, the world stood by as Syrian President Hafez al-Assad massacred thousands of his people in the city of Hama. Nearly 30 years later, is the world ready to again sit on the sidelines while his son follows in his footsteps? I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.